Every month, a stranger transferred $10,000 to me. This went on for 8 years. I never knew who he was. But one day, the bank called to tell me he had transferred $30 million to me and left a message. When I heard what he had to say, everything changed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. The heavy leather receipt folder hit my lap with a loud smack. I looked down at the gold-embossed logo of the most exclusive steakhouse in Atlanta, and then looked across the table at Connor. My white brother-in-law leaned back in his chair with a smug grin plastering his face. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and pointed a finger at me. He announced loudly that since I was the ghetto college dropout who brought absolutely zero prestige to the Carter family image, the least I could do was make myself useful and pay the $15,000 tab for Alicia and her medical school graduation dinner. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the glass in the suffocating silence that had fallen over our private dining room. Brenda, my mother, slammed her wine glass down so hard, the dark red liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. She leaned across the table, her eyes blazing with that familiar contempt she had reserved specifically for me since childhood. She started screaming that I had no right to sit there looking arrogant. Through her aggressive tirade, the entire restaurant learned exactly how she felt about me. She reminded everyone loudly that she had kicked me out of her house when I was 20 years old because I refused to follow her strict path. She yelled that I had thrown my life away on a cheap lip gloss hustle while my sister Alicia did the real work to become a doctor. Brenda made sure to emphasize the word doctor, treating it like a holy title, while waving her manicured hand dismissively in my direction. I listened to her rant, feeling the familiar sting of her words, but this time they lacked the power to break me. For 12 years she had spun this narrative to anyone who would listen. She told her church friends, her country club associates, and our extended family that I was a lost cause. She painted herself as the long-suffering mother of a rebellious failure while placing Alicia on an untouchable pedestal. Alicia sat next to Connor, perfectly poised in her designer dress, wearing a smug, entitled smile that matched her husband's. She did not say a word to defend me. She never did. She just twirled the stem of her champagne flute, soaking up the adoration and watching me take the hits. Connor leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table. He told me to stop dragging out the inevitable and just put a card down if I even had one that would not decline. He chuckled, looking at Alicia as if they were sharing a private joke at my expense. He said the family had tolerated my presence tonight out of pity, and that covering the bill was my admission fee to their elite circle. I placed my water glass down and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I asked her calmly if she genuinely believed I should pay for a celebration honoring the sister who had not spoken to me in 6 months prior to tonight. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. She stated that my attitude was exactly why I would always be at the bottom of the barrel. She pointed a sharp finger at me and delivered her ultimatum. She told me that if I did not pay this bill right now, I would be permanently banned from Alicia's upcoming graduation gala. She reminded me that the gala was the social event of the Atlanta season, filled with hospital administrators and high society figures, and that she would not allow a bitter, ungrateful child to ruin their perfect family portrait. Alicia finally chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She told me it was okay if I could not afford it, but that I should just admit my little online business was failing, so Connor could take care of the bill like a real provider. She patted Connor's arm, looking at me with pure condescension. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was still that terrified 20-year-old girl sleeping on a friend's couch, crying over a mother who did not want her. They had no idea that my cheap lip gloss hustle had evolved into a massive public relations and e-commerce empire. They had no idea I was sitting on multi-million-dollar contracts with national brands. I had kept my life completely separated from their toxicity, building my wealth in silence while they paraded their hollow achievements. I did not argue with them. I did not defend my business or my bank account. I simply opened my designer clutch and reached inside. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a solid metal card. I placed it on top of the leather folder and slid it slowly across the polished wood table until it stopped right in front of Connor. It was an exclusive invitation-only Centurion card, the legendary Black Amex. Connor's arrogant grin instantly vanished. The color drained from his face as he stared at the heavy black titanium card resting on the leather portfolio. He knew exactly what that card meant. He knew the exorbitant spending requirements and the massive net worth required just to receive an invitation to carry one. He looked from the card up to my face, his mouth slightly open, but no sound coming out. Alicia frowned, confused by her husband's sudden paralysis. She asked him what was wrong, but Connor could not form a sentence. He just kept staring at the card as if it had burned him. Brenda, realizing that her intimidation tactic had somehow derailed, demanded to know what kind of game I was playing. She accused me of bringing a fake credit card to dinner just to cause a scene and embarrass them. I smiled, letting the silence stretch out, allowing their discomfort to fill the room. The waiter approached our table, stepping hesitantly into the thick tension. He reached for the leather folder, but before his fingers could brush the metal card, my phone lit up. A sharp ringing cut through the heavy air of the dining room. I glanced at the screen. It was a private priority number. Normally, I would let it go to voicemail during dinner, but a strange intuition told me to answer. I picked up the phone and, without breaking eye contact with my mother, I pressed the speaker button. A polished professional voice echoed loudly over the silent table. The man introduced himself as a senior wealth manager from Chase Private Client. He asked to speak with Miss Jasmine Carter. I told him he was speaking to her. The banker cleared his throat. He announced that he was calling regarding the anonymous trust account that had been sending me $10,000 a month for the past 8 years. Brenda's eyes snapped wide open. She let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Alicia and Connor sat completely paralyzed, processing the words $10,000 a month. The banker continued, his voice steady and formal. He stated that the trust had just cleared a final wire transfer directly into my primary checking account. He said the amount was exactly $30 million. The room started spinning, but not for me. I watched the absolute shock obliterate the smugness on my family's faces. $30 million. The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone at the table except me. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it completely wiped away the years of humiliation I had endured in this family. But the banker was not finished. He paused for a moment and added one final detail. He said the sender had also left a highly classified video message for me. He informed me that the secure file had just been emailed to my private address and advised me to watch it immediately. I thanked the banker, my voice perfectly calm, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I ended the call and the screen went black. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The waiter stood frozen, holding his serving tray perfectly still, as if he had just witnessed a bomb go off. Brenda's jaw was practically on the floor. Her chest heaved as she tried to form words, but her brain was short-circuiting. Connor looked like he was going to be sick. The man who had just demanded I pay a $15,000 bill because I was a failure was now staring at a woman with $30 million in liquid cash sitting in her checking account. Alicia looked frantically between her husband and our mother, searching for someone to explain what had just happened. I did not give them the chance to regroup. I did not give them the satisfaction of an explanation. I reached across the table, picked up my black card and my phone, and stood up from my chair. I smoothed down the front of my dress, looked down at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, and offered them a chilling, victorious smile. I told Connor that it looked like I had more important business to attend to than paying for his dinner. I turned my back on them, leaving the unpaid bill sitting exactly where it was, and walked away from the table. The sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor felt like a victory march. I could hear Brenda suddenly snapping out of her shock, screaming my name and demanding I come back to explain myself. I heard chairs scraping against the floor as they scrambled to react, but I did not stop. I had $30 million a mystery to unravel and an empire to protect. The ghetto college dropout had just become the most powerful person in the room, and I was going to make sure they felt every single consequence of their cruelty. The heavy leather receipt folder hit my lap with a loud smack. I looked down at the gold embossed logo of the most exclusive steakhouse in Atlanta, and then looked across the table at Connor. My white brother-in-law leaned back in his chair with a smug grin plastering his face. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and pointed a finger at me. He announced loudly that since I was the ghetto college dropout who brought absolutely zero prestige to the Carter family image, the least I could do was make myself useful and pay the $15,000 tab for Alicia and her medical school graduation dinner. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the glass in the suffocating silence that had fallen over our private dining room. Brenda, my mother, slammed her wine glass down so hard the dark red liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. She leaned across the table, her eyes blazing with that familiar contempt she had reserved specifically for me since childhood. She started screaming that I had no right to sit there looking arrogant. Through her aggressive tirade, the entire restaurant learned exactly how she felt about me. She reminded everyone loudly that she had kicked me out of her house when I was 20 years old because I refused to follow her strict path. She yelled that I had thrown my life away on a cheap lip gloss hustle while my sister Alicia did the real work to become a doctor. Brenda made sure to emphasize the word doctor, treating it like a holy title while waving her manicured hand dismissively in my direction. I listened to her rant, feeling the familiar sting of her words, but this time they lacked the power to break me. For 12 years, she had spun this narrative to anyone who would listen. She told her church friends, her country club associates, and our extended family that I was a lost cause. She painted herself as the long-suffering mother of a rebellious failure while placing Alicia on an untouchable pedestal. Alicia sat next to Connor, perfectly poised in her designer dress, wearing a smug, entitled smile that matched her husband's. She did not say a word to defend me. She never did. She just twirled the stem of her champagne flute, soaking up the adoration and watching me take the hits. Connor leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table. He told me to stop dragging out the inevitable and just put a card down if I even had one that would not decline. He chuckled, looking at Alicia as if they were sharing a private joke at my expense. He said the family had tolerated my presence tonight out of pity, and that covering the bill was my admission fee to their elite circle. I placed my water glass down and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I asked her calmly if she genuinely believed I should pay for a celebration honoring the sister who had not spoken to me in 6 months prior to tonight. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. She stated that my attitude was exactly why I would always be at the bottom of the barrel. She pointed a sharp finger at me and delivered her ultimatum. She told me that if I did not pay this bill right now, I would be permanently banned from Alicia's upcoming graduation gala. She reminded me that the gala was the social event of the Atlanta season, filled with hospital administrators and high society figures, and that she would not allow a bitter, ungrateful child to ruin their perfect family portrait. Alicia finally chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She told me it was okay if I could not afford it, but that I should just admit my little online business was failing, so Connor could take care of the bill like a real provider. She patted Connor's arm, looking at me with pure condescension. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was still that terrified 20-year-old girl sleeping on a friend's couch, crying over a mother who did not want her. They had no idea that my cheap lip gloss hustle had evolved into a massive public relations and e-commerce empire. They had no idea I was sitting on multi-million-dollar contracts with national brands. I had kept my life completely separated from their toxicity, building my wealth in silence while they paraded their hollow achievements. I did not argue with them. I did not defend my business or my bank account. I simply opened my designer clutch and reached inside. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a solid metal card. I placed it on top of the leather folder and slid it slowly across the polished wood table until it stopped right in front of Connor. It was an exclusive invitation-only Centurion card, the legendary black Amex. Connor's arrogant grin instantly vanished. The color drained from his face as he stared at the heavy black titanium card resting on the leather portfolio. He knew exactly what that card meant. He knew the exorbitant spending requirements and the massive net worth required just to receive an invitation to carry one. He looked from the card up to my face, his mouth slightly open, but no sound coming out. Alicia frowned, confused by her husband's sudden paralysis. She asked him what was wrong, but Connor could not form a sentence. He just kept staring at the card as if it had burned him. Brenda, realizing that her intimidation tactic had somehow derailed, demanded to know what kind of game I was playing. She accused me of bringing a fake credit card to dinner just to cause a scene and embarrass them. I smiled, letting the silence stretch out, allowing their discomfort to fill the room. The waiter approached our table, stepping hesitantly into the thick tension. He reached for the leather folder, but before his fingers could brush the metal card, my phone lit up. A sharp ringing cut through the heavy air of the dining room. I glanced at the screen. It was a private priority number. Normally, I would let it go to voicemail during dinner, but a strange intuition told me to answer. I picked up the phone, and without breaking eye contact with my mother, I pressed the speaker button. A polished professional voice echoed loudly over the silent table. The man introduced himself as a senior wealth manager from Chase Private Client. He asked to speak with Ms. Jasmine Carter. I told him he was speaking to her. The banker cleared his throat. He announced that he was calling regarding the anonymous trust account that had been sending me $10,000 a month for the past 8 years. Brenda's eyes snapped wide open. She let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Alicia and Connor sat completely paralyzed, processing the words $10,000 a month. The banker continued, his voice steady and formal. He stated that the trust had just cleared a final wire transfer directly into my primary checking account. He said the amount was exactly $30 million. The room started spinning, but not for me. I watched the absolute shock obliterate the smugness on my family's faces. $30 million. The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone at the table except me. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it completely wiped away the years of humiliation I had endured in this family. But the banker was not finished. He paused for a moment and added one final detail. He said the sender had also left a highly classified video message for me. He informed me that the secure file had just been emailed to my private address and advised me to watch it immediately. I thanked the banker, my voice perfectly calm despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I ended the call and the screen went black. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The waiter stood frozen, holding his serving tray perfectly still, as if he had just witnessed a bomb go off. The moment the banker confirmed the $30 million transfer, Brenda completely lost her mind. She lunged across the white linen tablecloth, sending crystal wine glasses shattering onto the hardwood floor. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed through the air, desperately trying to snatch my phone. She screamed, demanding to know who was on the line and what kind of sick joke I was playing. I did not flinch. I simply took a swift, graceful step backward, letting her manicured nails swipe at empty air. I turned on my heel and walked directly toward the restaurant's private glass-walled VIP lounge, situated just a few feet behind our table. I pulled the heavy mahogany and glass door shut behind me and slid the solid brass deadbolt firmly into place. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot. Instantly, the chaotic noise of the dining room was muted into a dull hum. I stood in the center of the plush leather room and watched the spectacle unfold on the other side of the glass. Brenda slammed her palms against the soundproof panes, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She shouted commands I could no longer hear. Connor rushed up right behind her, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. He pounded his fists against the glass, trying to intimidate me, using his physical size to demand compliance just like he always did. For years, he had belittled me, assuming my silence was weakness. Now he looked like a panicked animal trapped in an exhibit. I ignored them entirely. I sat down slowly on the luxurious leather sofa, crossing my legs, and looked down at my phone. A secure notification from Chase Wealth Management was waiting in my inbox. Attached was a highly encrypted video file requiring facial recognition to open. I unlocked it. The screen brightened, revealing a stark contrast to the lively restaurant outside. The video showed an older African-American man lying in a sterile, high-tech hospital bed. Even diminished by illness, he possessed an undeniable aura of power and quiet dignity. He looked into the camera and spoke my name. His voice was deep, resonant, and filled with a profound sorrow that instantly commanded my attention. He introduced himself as Reginald. He told me he was my biological father. A shockwave ripped through my chest, but I could not look away. He explained that he was recording this message because his battle with pancreatic cancer was ending, and he did not have much time left. He wanted me to hear the truth from his own lips before Brenda could spin another web of lies. He told me he never abandoned me. 32 years ago, he was a young, ambitious executive building what would become a massive corporate empire. He was also married. When Brenda discovered she was pregnant, she did not see a child. She saw a lottery ticket. She used my existence as a bargaining chip, threatening to go to the press, to his board of directors, and to his wife with a fabricated scandal that would destroy his entire life if he did not pay her millions in silence money. She forced him to sign away his parental rights and sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. If he ever tried to see me, she promised to ruin him and take me far away where he could never track us down. Reginald paid her extortion fees for decades, believing he was doing the right thing to keep me safe. But 12 years ago, everything changed. He discovered that Brenda had kicked me out of the house. Brenda had told him I became a junkie who ran away to the streets. Reginald refused to believe it. He hired a team of elite private investigators to track me down. They found me working 3 jobs, sleeping on friends' couches, and desperately trying to launch my public relations and e-commerce firm from a broken laptop. Reginald said his heart broke watching me struggle, but he knew if he stepped in publicly, Brenda would unleash her extortion protocols and drag me into a vicious media circus. So he found a loophole. He set up the anonymous trust. The $10,000 a month was his secret way to bypass Brenda's insatiable greed to ensure I had food, a safe roof, and the capital to fund my dreams. He watched me build my empire from the shadows. He told me how incredibly proud he was of the fearless, brilliant businesswoman I had become. I had his relentless spirit. He finished the video by telling me that the $30 million in liquid cash and the vast portfolio of real estate assets were now legally mine. Hunt urged me to use the power he was giving me to shatter the chains Brenda had kept me in. The screen faded to black, leaving me alone in the quiet lounge. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of validation. I finally understood why I never fit into Brenda's mold. I was built from an entirely different cloth. I wiped my face, squared my shoulders, and stood up. The grief for the father I never got to embrace fueled a blazing inferno of righteous anger toward the woman who stole him from me. I walked to the glass door and unbolted the brass lock. The noise of the restaurant crashed back into my ears. Connor was currently screaming at the red-faced general manager, demanding that they call the police to have me arrested for causing a public disturbance. He pointed at me wildly, claiming I was mentally unstable and a threat to his family. I walked right past his pointing finger. I stopped at the waiter's station, dropped my black Amex onto the silver tray, and instructed the waiter to charge the entire $15,000 bill, add a 50% gratuity for his trouble, and bring me the receipt. Then I turned my full attention back to the dining table. Alicia was hyperventilating, clutching her napkin, and demanding to know what kind of fraudulent stunt I was pulling. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my designer bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Reginald's bankers had not just sent me money. They had sent a comprehensive intelligence briefing on the people who had abused me. I dropped the heavy folder directly onto Alicia's empty dinner plate. I told her she should open it before she made a fool of herself defending a thief. Alicia hesitated, her hands shaking as she pulled out the stack of financial documents. I narrated the truth loudly, ensuring the neighboring tables caught every single word. I explained that the documents contained wire transfer logs, bank routing numbers, and offshore betting accounts belonging to her perfect husband. Connor had not paid for her final year of medical school. He had intercepted the massive tuition checks Brenda gave them and funneled every single cent into illegal underground sports betting rings. He was currently hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to dangerous bookies who were actively threatening his life. Alicia let out a blood-curdling scream. She threw the papers back at me, her pristine facade shattering into a million pieces. She aggressively accused me of fabricating fake banking records out of pure jealousy because I was a bitter single woman who could never land a high-earning, successful man like Connor. Connor was sweating profusely, stuttering out frantic denials while desperately trying to snatch the papers off the table to destroy the evidence. But Brenda was not looking at the papers. Brenda was not defending Connor or rushing to comfort her golden child. Brenda's eyes were locked entirely on the screen of my phone, which I had placed face up on the table. The Chase private client portal was still open. The $30 million available balance glowed brightly against the stark white background of the app. All the color drained from Brenda's face, leaving her looking like a hollow shell. Her hands shook violently as she reached out, hovering over the screen without touching it. She looked up at me, all the arrogant superiority completely eradicated from her features. She whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. She asked if Reginald died today. She did not care about Connor's gambling or Alicia's tears. She only cared that her lifetime of extortion had just evaporated. She finally realized the gravy train was dead, and the daughter she threw away like trash now held the keys to the entire kingdom. The high-definition screen of my phone flickered to life. The chaotic, muffled thumping of Brenda and Connor pounding against the VIP lounge glass instantly faded into white noise as a face appeared on the display. It was an older African-American man, resting against a mountain of pillows, in a sterile but hyper-luxurious hospital suite. Medical monitors blinked rhythmically in the background, but he did not look like a victim. Even diminished by illness, he radiated an undeniable aura of power and quiet dignity. He wore a dark silk robe, and his piercing brown eyes looked directly into the camera lens with a profound sorrow that commanded my full attention. He took a slow, labored breath and spoke my name. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried a heavy weight of regret. He introduced himself as Reginald. He did not waste time with pleasantries or vague introductions. He looked straight through the screen and delivered a sentence that shattered my entire reality into a million jagged pieces. He told me he was my biological father. A shockwave ripped through my chest so violently I physically gasped. I instinctively looked up from the screen toward the soundproof glass. Brenda was still out there, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage, her palms slapping aggressively against the barrier. I looked back down at the dying billionaire on my phone. The resemblance was undeniable. I had his jawline, his intense gaze, and the exact same shape of his cheekbones. For 32 years, Brenda had told me my father was a deadbeat who ran off before I was born. She had weaponized my fatherless status, using it to explain why I was inherently flawed and why Alicia, the daughter of her second husband, was naturally superior. Reginald coughed weakly before continuing. He explained that he was recording this highly secure message because his battle with terminal pancreatic cancer was ending, and he only had days left to live. He needed me to hear the absolute truth from his own lips before Brenda could spin another toxic web of lies to control the narrative. He told me he never abandoned me. 32 years ago, he was a young, fiercely ambitious executive on the verge of taking his first company public. I was also a married man, navigating the complex world of Atlanta high society. When Brenda discovered she was pregnant, she did not see a child to love. She saw a golden lottery ticket. Reginald explained the ruthless precision of Brenda's extortion. She did not just ask for basic child support. She orchestrated a full-blown blackmail campaign. She threatened to go directly to the press, to his conservative board of directors, and to his wife with a meticulously fabricated scandal designed to obliterate his entire corporate empire and personal life if he did not pay her millions in silence money. She forced him to sign away his parental rights completely. She demanded ironclad non-disclosure agreements. If he ever tried to see me or claim me as his daughter, she promised to ruin him and take me far away to a place where he could never track us down. Reginald paid her extortion fees for decades. He wired millions into Brenda's secret accounts, believing he was doing the right thing to keep me safe. He thought he was funding a beautiful, privileged life for me. He thought his massive financial sacrifice was buying my happiness. He had no idea Brenda was hoarding his wealth, using his hard-earned money to buy Alicia designer clothes, private tutors, and luxury cars, while forcing me to wear second-hand hand-me-downs and scrub the floors. But 12 years ago, everything changed. Reginald hired a discreet team of elite private investigators to do a welfare check on me. He just wanted to know what college I was attending so he could secretly pay my tuition. Instead, his investigators uncovered a nightmare. They discovered that Brenda had viciously kicked me out of the house. Brenda had actively told people, including Reginald, that I had become a violent junkie who ran away to live on the streets. Reginald refused to believe her toxic lies. He ordered his security team to tear the city apart looking for me. They found me. But I was not on drugs and I was not a criminal. They found a terrified, exhausted 20-year-old girl working 3 grueling jobs just to afford cheap ramen noodles. They found me sleeping on my friends' lumpy couches. They found me staying up until 3 in the morning, desperately trying to launch my public relations and e-commerce firm from a cracked second-hand laptop. Reginald paused in the video, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He said his heart broke watching me struggle from afar, but his hands were tied. He knew if he stepped in publicly and claimed me, Brenda would immediately unleash her extortion protocols. She would drag me into a vicious media circus and destroy the fragile business I was trying to build. She would use me as a pawn all over again to drain his accounts. So Reginald found a brilliant legal loophole. He set up an anonymous offshore trust entirely separate from his primary estate. The $10,000 a month was his secret weapon. It was his way to bypass Brenda's insatiable greed and ensure I had food, a safe roof over my head, and the capital to fund my entrepreneurial dreams. He was the phantom benefactor who saved me when I was drowning. He watched me build my empire from the shadows. He listed my accomplishments in the video, citing the exact dates I landed my first major national brand contracts. He knew about my corporate headquarters downtown. He knew about my expanding payroll and my flawless reputation in the industry. He told me how incredibly proud he was of the fearless, brilliant businesswoman I had become. He said I did not inherit Brenda's toxic manipulation. I had inherited his relentless, unyielding spirit. I was a true mogul. He finished the video with a directive that made my blood run cold with pure power. He stated that the $30 million in liquid cash was wired directly into my checking account to intentionally bypass the lengthy probate period. He wanted me to have immediate, untraceable financial firepower to wage war. I explained that the massive portfolio of Atlanta commercial real estate assets was also now legally mine, holding deeds that Brenda and Alicia currently relied on for their fake high society lifestyle. He had structured his final will so airtight that no lawyer on earth could contest it. He urged me to use the immense power he was giving me to shatter the chains Brenda had kept me in. He told me to show no mercy to the people who tried to bury me because I was born to rule. The screen faded to black, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet luxury of the VIP lounge. I sat frozen on the leather sofa, processing the monumental shift in my universe. The tears streaming down my face were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were tears of pure validation. I finally understood why I never fit into Brenda's mold. I was built from an entirely different cloth. The grief I felt for the father I never got to embrace fueled a blazing inferno of righteous anger toward the woman who stole him from me. I wiped my face, squared my shoulders, and stood up. The ghetto college dropout was dead. I was a billionaire heiress and a self-made CEO, and I was about to make Brenda pay for every single lie. Brenda's whisper hung in the heavy air of the dining room. I watched her face closely. The sheer terror that had gripped her features only seconds ago began to physically melt away, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. I saw the exact moment my mother calculated her pivot. The ruthless extortionist vanished, and the fiercely protective, loving matriarch took the stage. Brenda completely turned her back on Alicia and Connor. She ignored her golden child sobbing over a shattered marriage. She ignored her prized white son-in-law sweating through his designer suit over illegal gambling debts. They were no longer useful to her. I was the target now. Brenda stepped around the wreckage of the dinner table, carefully avoiding the shattered crystal wine glasses on the hardwood floor. She reached out her arms, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet maternal warmth. She called me her sweet, beautiful girl. She took another step forward, attempting to grab my hands, but I took a sharp step back, leaving her grasping at empty air. Brenda let out a theatrical, heartbreaking sigh, ensuring the wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables could hear her award-winning performance. She told me I did not understand the complexity of the situation. She claimed she had carried a terrible, agonizing burden for 32 years just to keep me safe. She started weaving a narrative so deeply fabricated it was almost impressive to witness in real time. She painted Reginald not as a victim of her relentless blackmail, but as a toxic, absent predator who abandoned us both. She raised her voice slightly, addressing me, but clearly performing for the captivated audience in the restaurant. She declared that Reginald was a monster who only cared about his pristine corporate image and his high society wife. She claimed he threatened to destroy our family if she ever brought me around his legitimate children. She lied flawlessly, stating that she demanded those monthly payments from him not out of greed, but as rightful child support to ensure I had a future. She clutched her chest over her designer dress, acting as though the secret had been eating her alive every single day. She said she hid his identity to protect my heart because she could not bear to watch a powerful, ruthless man treat her precious daughter like a dirty little secret. I stood there listening to her rewrite history with absolute precision. I knew the truth. I had the financial records, the extortion emails, and Reginald's own dying confession securely stored on my phone. But Brenda was relentless. She smoothly transitioned from the protective, heartbroken mother to the pragmatic, seasoned financial advisor. She gestured toward my phone, still displaying the $30 million balance on the banking app. She warned me that the money was incredibly dangerous. She claimed Reginald's legitimate heirs and his corporate litigation lawyers would be coming after me by morning. She said they would tie me up in endless federal court battles, freeze my bank accounts, and drag my name through the mud in the press. She told me I needed a shield to survive the coming storm. Then she made her ultimate demand. She insisted that I immediately transfer the entire $30 million into the Carter family trust. I actually laughed out loud. The sound cut through her dramatic monologue. I pointed directly at Connor, who was currently leaning heavily against the mahogany bar, looking like he was about to vomit his expensive steak. I reminded her that her precious son-in-law, the man who legally managed the Carter family trust, was just exposed as a desperate criminal who stole his own wife's medical school tuition to pay off violent underground bookies. Brenda waved her manicured hand, dismissing Connor's federal felonies as if they were a minor parking ticket. She stated coldly that Connor's personal indiscretions would be handled internally by the family. She insisted the trust itself was a secure financial vehicle, completely protected from individual liabilities. She stepped closer, dropping her voice into a tone of weaponized concern. This was her signature move. This was the tactic she had used to break me down when I was younger. She brought up my past. She did it loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear, ensuring my humiliation was a public spectacle. She reminded me of my severe mental breakdown 12 years ago. She painted my depression during college not as a direct result of her constant emotional abuse and impossible toxic expectations, but as a fundamental biological flaw in my brain. She told everyone listening that I was incredibly fragile. She recounted how the pressure of college exams had broken me when I was 20. She described in graphic detail how I stopped eating, how I could not get out of bed, how I had a complete psychological collapse that forced her to make the hard choice of removing me from school. She used my darkest, most vulnerable moments as heavy ammunition. She declared with absolute fake certainty that I did not have the psychological fortitude to handle $30 million. She warned that this sudden massive influx of wealth would trigger a severe manic episode. She told the room I would lose every single cent to scammers or impulsive bad investments before the year was over. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with manufactured pity. She told me to be a good girl and sign the funds over to the trust tonight so she could protect me from myself just like she always had. She claimed it was the only way to keep the money safe from my own unstable mind. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, marveling at the sheer audacity of her manipulation. She was trying to publicly shame me into handing over a billionaire fortune by reducing me to a helpless, broken child. She thought she still held the emotional kill switch to my self-esteem. She thought her words still had the power to make me doubt my own sanity. But she was speaking to a ghost. The fragile girl she broke 12 years ago did not exist anymore. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece into a corporate powerhouse. I managed crisis communications for Fortune 500 companies. I navigated high-stakes negotiations with ruthless executives every single day. Brenda's gaslighting was nothing more than a cheap parlor trick compared to the boardroom wars I had won. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at her with pure, unadulterated indifference. I told her that her performance was truly remarkable, but her script was severely outdated. I informed her that my mental health was perfectly fine, and the only thing toxic and unstable in my life was standing right in front of me, wearing a stolen pearl necklace. I watched the fake maternal warmth drain from her eyes, replaced instantly by raw, vicious panic as she realized her ultimate manipulation tactic had completely failed. A sharp, loud laugh erupted from my chest. It was not a polite chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the exclusive dining room. Brenda flinched as if I had struck her across the face. For my entire life, she had conditioned me to shrink under her glare, to apologize for simply existing, and to beg for her scraps of affection. But looking at her now, dripping in designer clothes paid for by relentless blackmail, I saw exactly what she was. She was a fraud. I took a confident step forward, closing the distance between us, and forced her to look me in the eye. I raised my voice just enough so the prominent society members and church elders dining at the adjacent tables could catch every single word. I asked my mother how she managed to sit in the front pew of the church every Sunday morning singing hymns about grace and redemption while actively extorting millions of dollars from a dying man. I watched the blood drain from her face as the people around us stopped pretending not to listen and openly turned their heads toward our table. I did not stop there. I reminded her of all the times she stood at the pulpit testifying about her hard work and divine blessings, wearing her expensive custom hats, and acting like the moral compass of Atlanta. I stripped away her holy facade piece by piece in front of her peers. I told her that her entire affluent lifestyle, her luxury cars, the private school tuitions for Alicia, and the massive house in the suburbs were not gifts from a higher power. They were the direct result of a ruthless, decades-long blackmail campaign. I stated clearly that she was nothing but a high-class parasite who sold her own daughter for a paycheck. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, to spin another web of religious justification, but no words came out. The sheer weight of the public exposure paralyzed her. She had spent 32 years building a pristine reputation in our community, and I was systematically torching it to the ground in under 5 minutes. She looked around the restaurant, seeing the judgmental stares of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. That was when Connor decided to intervene. Desperation makes people stupid, and Connor was drowning in dangerous debt. He stepped in front of Brenda, physically blocking my path to the exit. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his inherent privilege to intimidate me. His face was a blotchy red and sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his carefully styled appearance. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and shifted the attack from emotional manipulation to legal threats. He loudly declared that I was not walking away with a single cent of the Carter family money. He aggressively stated that as the manager of the family trust, he was going to file an emergency injunction the very next morning. He threatened to drag me into federal court and sue me for elder abuse. He spun a ridiculous, frantic narrative claiming that I had maliciously tracked down a vulnerable, terminally ill billionaire and coerced him into changing his financial directives on his deathbed. He yelled that Reginald was not in his right mind and that I had manipulated a sick old man out of his fortune just to spite my loving family. Connor puffed himself up, demanding that I hand over the banking details immediately, or he would have me indicted for wire fraud. He tried to sound like a high-powered attorney, giving me a final ultimatum before unleashing a team of ruthless litigators who would tie me up in court for the next 10 years. He told me I was out of my depth and that a college dropout could never defeat him in a legal battle. I looked at my white brother-in-law and smiled coldly. I did not raise my hand or back away. I stood my ground, radiating the kind of power that cannot be bought or faked. I simply asked him how he planned to afford a team of ruthless litigators when he could not even pay off the violent underground bookies who were currently hunting him down for his gambling debts. Connor's jaw snapped shut, his chest deflated instantly. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space and dropping my voice to a lethal calm tone. I reminded him that I had just dropped a thick manila folder on the table containing irrefutable proof of his offshore accounts and his theft of Alicia's medical school tuition. I pointed out that if he filed a single piece of paperwork against me, I would not just fight him in civil court. I would personally hand-deliver his entire financial dossier to the federal authorities and the gambling syndicate he owed money to. I told him I had $30 million in liquid cash to hire the most vicious corporate lawyers in the country, and I would drag out the discovery process until he was completely bankrupt, divorced, and sitting in a federal penitentiary. I watched the last shred of arrogance vanish from his eyes. He swallowed hard, taking a slow step back. I looked over his shoulder at Alicia, who was still weeping silently into her hands, utterly humiliated by her husband's exposure and the destruction of her perfect graduation dinner. Then I looked back at Brenda, who was trembling with silent rage and pure terror as she realized there was no manipulation tactic left in her arsenal. I told them they had played their hands terribly. I informed them that they would never see a single dime of my father's money. I promised them that the gravy train was permanently derailed, and they would have to learn how to survive in the real world without a secret billionaire funding their illusions of grandeur. I suggested they get used to the idea of actually working for a living because their days of stealing and extorting were officially over. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on the wreckage of my supposed family, grabbed my designer clutch, and walked toward the exit of the restaurant. The dining room was dead silent as I passed through. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. The patrons just watched me glide across the hardwood floors with my head held high. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and stepped out into the cool evening air. I handed my ticket to the valet, feeling an intoxicating rush of absolute freedom as I waited for my car, leaving them inside to choke on the ashes of their burned-down empire. The crisp, Atlanta night air hit my face like a baptism. I stood under the glowing amber lights of the steakhouse awning, taking a deep breath of absolute victory. I handed my ticket to the young valet and watched him jog off toward the luxury parking garage. The adrenaline that had carried me through the dining room was settling into a cold, razor-sharp focus. I had just detonated a 32-year-old lie, and I knew Brenda was inside scrambling to glue the pieces of her fake high society life back together. I felt an intoxicating rush of absolute freedom as I waited for my car. I was finally leaving them behind to choke on the ashes of their burned-down empire. But I did not have time to enjoy the silence. Heavy, frantic footsteps slapped against the concrete behind me. I turned around to find Connor bursting through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. The arrogant, perfectly groomed white brother-in-law, who had just threatened to throw me in federal prison, was completely gone. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate man falling apart at the seams. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose, and his tailored suit jacket was heavily rumpled. Sweat poured down his reddened face, catching the ambient light of the street lamps. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting back and forth through the glass doors to ensure Brenda and Alicia had not followed him out into the night. He scurried over to me, stepping out of the bright valet area and trying to pull me into the shadows near a row of decorative hedges. I stood my ground, refusing to move an inch. I crossed my arms and stared at him, watching the sheer panic radiate from his pores. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a cornered animal. He held up both hands in a placating gesture, totally abandoning the aggressive, dominant persona he used inside the restaurant. He swallowed hard, his breath smelling like stale fear and expensive scotch. He leaned in close, dropping his voice to a frantic, hurried whisper. He told me I needed to listen to him very carefully because we did not have much time before Alicia came looking for him. He tried to act like we were sudden allies teaming up against a common enemy. He told me that Brenda and Alicia were going to bleed me dry. He said my mother would hire a fleet of vicious estate lawyers to drag me through probate court for the next decade until the legal fees ate up half my fortune. He claimed Alicia was already inside crying to her medical school administrators, trying to build a case that I was emotionally unstable and needed to be institutionalized so they could seize control of the trust. He painted a picture of absolute warfare, trying to make me feel isolated and terrified so I would lean on him for support. Then he made his pitch. He told me he was a financial manager, and he knew exactly how the wealthy moved their money. He offered to be my inside man. He promised he could set up an intricate web of offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and transfer the $30 million through untraceable corporate entities. He swore he could hide every single cent of my inheritance so deep in the international financial system that Brenda and Alicia would never be able to touch a dime of it. I tried to sell himself as my savior, the only person who could protect my new billionaire status from my own greedy mother. I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his proposal hang in the cool night air. The man who had just stolen his own wife's medical school tuition was now offering to manage my $30 million fortune. He actually believed I was stupid enough to hand him the keys to my empire. But Connor was not finished. The facade of the helpful financial advisor cracked, revealing the raw, bleeding desperation underneath. His voice broke as the truth finally spilled out of him. He grabbed the lapels of his own jacket, his knuckles turning white as he shook with terror. He confessed that he was in deep, unimaginable trouble. He admitted that the tuition money he stole from Alicia was already gone, completely blown on high-stakes underground sports betting that he thought was a sure thing. He told me the bookies he owed were not the kind of men who took payment plans or negotiated terms. They were violent, dangerous people who knew where he lived and knew exactly where Alicia worked. I was shaking now, openly begging me. He told me he needed a 20% cut of my $30 million immediately. He said if I transferred $6 million to a specific routing number tonight, he could clear his debts and keep his legs from being broken. He told me the federal authorities were already auditing his investment firm, and if he did not replace the missing client funds by Friday, he was going to be indicted for wire fraud and sent directly to federal prison. He pleaded with me, telling me I was his only way out, and that paying him $6 million was a small price to pay to keep the rest of my fortune safe from Brenda's legal attacks. He actually tried to frame his extortion attempt as a business transaction that would benefit us both. I listened to his entire sweaty, pathetic confession without interrupting him once. I did not blink. I did not show an ounce of sympathy. I watched a man who had spent years treating me like a second-class citizen, now groveling at my feet for his very survival. He had spent years riding the coattails of Brenda's stolen wealth, projecting an image of white corporate superiority, while secretly drowning in his own criminal incompetence. Now the mask was off, and he was nothing but a terrified thief begging a successful black woman to save his life. When he finally ran out of breath, he stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for my answer. He honestly believed his manipulation had worked. I let out a slow, chilling laugh. I uncrossed my arms and slowly raised my left wrist. I looked him dead in the eye and tapped the sleek, glowing face of my smartwatch. I told Connor that his pitch was incredibly detailed, and I was sure the federal authorities would find his offshore financial strategies absolutely fascinating. I informed him that I had triggered the audio recording app on my watch the exact second he started talking about hiding money in the Cayman Islands. I smiled a freezing, predatory smile as I told him I just recorded his entire unprompted confession detailing his underground gambling debts, his plan to hide assets, and his blatant attempt to extort $6 million from me. Connor's mouth fell open in absolute horror. His knees actually buckled slightly as the reality of what he had just done crashed down on him. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing under the streetlights. He reached a trembling hand toward my wrist, but stopped short, paralyzed by the realization that any physical move against me would only add assault to his growing list of federal charges. I stepped closer, invading his space and delivering the final blow. I told him he was right about one thing. I was a brilliant businesswoman, and I always protected my assets. I promised him that if he or anyone else in that restaurant ever tried to file a single piece of legal paperwork against me, I would email this crystal-clear audio file directly to the federal prosecutors currently investigating his firm. I told him to go back inside and enjoy his steak because it might be his last decent meal before Friday. The valet pulled my sleek custom black SUV up to the curb, leaving the engine running. I turned my back on Connor, leaving him completely paralyzed and hyperventilating in the dark parking lot. I tipped the valet, slipped into the luxurious leather driver's seat, and drove off into the Atlanta night, knowing my empire was secure and their nightmare had just begun. Exactly 48 hours had passed since I left my brother-in-law, sweating and paralyzed in the dark parking lot of that steakhouse. I had not heard a single word from my family since that night. No frantic text messages. No manipulative voicemails. The silence was not a surrender. I knew it was the calm before a highly calculated storm. They were regrouping and I was ready for them. I was standing on the top floor of my corporate headquarters, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling downtown Atlanta skyline. This building was the physical manifestation of my blood, sweat, and tears. It was a massive, sleek, multi-story glass high-rise that housed Carter Communications and e-commerce. We occupied 5 floors of prime real estate managing public relations and digital product distribution for some of the biggest national brands in the country. Hundreds of brilliant employees worked under my direction. We had our own in-house production studios, dedicated legal departments, and a massive logistics center. This was the very same business my mother had spent the last decade dismissing as a cheap lip gloss hustle. Brenda had actively told her country club friends and the entire congregation at her church that I was sitting in a dingy basement somewhere wasting my life boxing up cheap cosmetics. She needed to diminish my reality so she could elevate Alicia's medical career. She had never once asked for my office address. She had never once inquired about my profit margins. She assumed that because I did not follow her specific path, I was fundamentally destined for poverty. My desk phone chimed, cutting through my thoughts. It was the head of my building's security team calling from the ground floor. His voice was tense but strictly professional. He informed me that I had an unauthorized situation developing in the main lobby. He said a woman claiming to be my mother had just breached the security turnstiles alongside my sister and a team of 4 very aggressive men in expensive suits. The security chief told me they were causing a massive public spectacle, shouting at the receptionists and demanding to be granted immediate access to the executive penthouse. I did not panic. I did not tell security to have them forcibly removed. I told my security chief to let them stay right where they were in the center of the lobby. I wanted to handle this personally. I took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. As the silver doors slid open, the sheer scale of the chaos greeted me. The lobby of Carter Communications was a testament to modern corporate power, featuring imported Italian marble floors, massive indoor water features, and a 50-foot digital display screen showcasing our current national brand campaigns. It was a space designed to intimidate and impress. Standing dead center in all that grandeur was Brenda. She was flanked by Alicia and 4 ruthless-looking corporate attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases. I watched as Alicia stared up at the massive digital screens, her jaw visibly slack. She was looking around the lobby, absorbing the sheer wealth and corporate magnitude of the space. Her eyes darted to the busy professionals moving through the security gates, wearing badges bearing my company logo. The reality of my success was hitting her like a physical blow. She had walked into this building fully expecting to find a small, struggling warehouse operation. Finding herself standing inside a corporate fortress that rivaled the finest hospitals in the state completely shattered her sense of superiority. Brenda, however, was not looking at the architecture. She was completely focused on creating a scene. She was raising her voice, projecting a tone of hysterical maternal panic meant to draw the attention of every employee and visiting client in the lobby. She was clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest, playing the role of a devastated mother desperate to save her sick child. I walked out of the elevator bay, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. My posture was straight and my expression was pure ice. I did not invite them up to a private conference room. I stopped 10 feet away from them, forcing them to confront me in the wide-open public space. Brenda locked eyes with me and immediately launched into her performance. She cried out my name, rushing forward, as if she wanted to embrace me. She shouted for everyone to hear that she had finally found me, and that she was here to get me the medical help I desperately needed. She told the crowded lobby that she was not going to let me destroy my life. I held up a single hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. I told her in a calm, lethal voice to drop the theater act because there were no church elders here to impress. The lead attorney stepped forward, cutting in front of Brenda. He was a tall, arrogant man with a slicked-back haircut who looked at me with undisguised condescension. He did not introduce himself politely. He aggressively shoved a thick stack of legal documents toward my chest. I did not reach out to take them, letting the papers fall and scatter across the polished marble floor between us. The lawyer sneered, adjusting his tie. He announced in a booming, authoritative voice that his firm was legally serving me with an emergency conservatorship order. The words echoed in the massive lobby. An emergency conservatorship. I stared at the man, understanding exactly what Brenda had spent the last 48 hours doing. She knew she could not extort the $30 million from me voluntarily, so she decided to legally strip me of my human rights. The lawyer loudly declared that they had filed an emergency injunction with the state to freeze every single one of my personal banking accounts and seize total operational control of Carter Communications. He claimed they had sworn affidavits from my mother and my sister, stating that I was currently experiencing a severe, dangerous manic episode. He stated that I posed an immediate threat to my own safety and my financial assets. Brenda stepped up beside the lawyer, wiping fake tears from her eyes. She looked at the onlookers in the lobby, speaking to them instead of me. She loudly proclaimed that I had a long documented history of severe mental instability. She weaponized my past college depression, twisting the narrative to claim I had suffered a total psychological collapse. She lied flawlessly, stating that the sudden traumatic news of my biological father's death had triggered a psychotic break. She claimed that I had stolen $30 million from his estate in a moment of delusion, and that I was completely unfit to manage my own life, let alone a corporation. Alicia finally found her voice, chiming in to support the lies. She crossed her arms, trying to look authoritative. She stated that as a medical professional, she fully supported the conservatorship. She claimed she had personally evaluated my erratic behavior at the restaurant 2 nights ago and determined I required immediate psychiatric institutionalization. She told me to stop fighting them and just surrender my business operations to the family trust so they could protect my assets while I was locked away in a facility getting treatment. They wanted to completely erase me. They wanted to steal my $30 million inheritance, steal the corporate empire I built from the ground up, and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to maintain their luxury lifestyle. They believed they could march into my territory, throw around aggressive legal jargon, and terrorize me into submission. I looked down at the legal documents scattered across the floor, and then looked back up at the 4 expensive lawyers standing like a firing squad. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry or show a single ounce of the emotional instability they were falsely accusing me of. I remained perfectly composed, a predator watching its prey step blindly into a trap. I told the lead attorney that his emergency conservatorship order was the most fascinating piece of creative fiction I had read all year. I asked him if he had bothered to do even 10 minutes of basic due diligence before he marched into the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar corporation to threaten its chief executive officer. I asked him if Brenda had informed his legal team that her precious son-in-law was currently under federal investigation for wire fraud, or if she conveniently left that part. The arrogant lawyer scoffed, stepping closer to try and physically intimidate me. He told me that my paranoid accusations against my brother-in-law only further proved my mental instability. He demanded that I surrender my security badge and comply with the asset freeze immediately, or he would have the local police drag me out of my own building in handcuffs. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that made the lawyer hesitate for a fraction of a second. I reached a hand into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my phone. I told Brenda that she was right about one thing. I was a very busy woman managing a massive empire, and I did not have time to deal with uninvited trespassers. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I pressed a single button on my screen, sending a silent alert to the penthouse floor. I informed the aggressive legal team that if they wanted to discuss asset freezes and corporate law, they were going to have to speak to my people. The soft chime of the private executive elevators echoed through the cavernous marble lobby, where sets of polished steel doors slid open in perfect unison. Stepping out into the bright atrium was my general counsel, Julian, accompanied by 6 senior partners from one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Atlanta. They did not walk, they marched. They moved with the synchronized precision of an elite military strike team, stepping onto a battlefield they had already conquered. They wore custom-tailored suits and carried themselves with an undeniable aura of absolute authority. Julian, a tall, impeccably dressed African American man with a notoriously sharp mind and zero tolerance for foolishness, took the lead. He glided across the marble floor, stopping right beside me. He did not spare a single glance for my mother or my sister. His piercing gaze was locked entirely on the arrogant lawyer who had just tried to intimidate me. Julian calmly adjusted his jacket and introduced himself as the head of legal operations for Carter Communications and the primary executor liaison for my newly acquired estate. He looked down at the emergency conservatorship documents still scattered across the floor. He did not ask permission. He simply gestured to one of his junior partners, who swiftly gathered the papers and handed them to him. Julian scanned the first page. A low, dry chuckle escaped his chest. It was a sound that completely drained the aggressive energy right out of Brenda's legal team. Julian looked up and asked the opposing lawyer where he had obtained his law degree, because the paperwork he had just attempted to serve was riddled with fundamental jurisdictional errors. The arrogant lawyer puffed out his chest, attempting to regain control of the situation. He loudly stated that the injunction was a legally binding state mandate designed to protect a vulnerable individual experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis. He demanded that Julian step aside and allow the asset freeze to take immediate effect. Julian did not step aside. He stepped forward, invading the man's personal space. He held up the document and began to systematically dismantle it piece by piece in front of the entire crowded lobby. First, Julian addressed the claim regarding my mental fitness. He pulled a sealed envelope from his inside pocket and handed it directly to the opposing counsel. Julian explained that those were certified medical and psychological evaluations conducted by two independent board-certified psychiatrists just yesterday morning. The evaluations had been preemptively mandated by Reginald's estate planners as a standard condition of the $30 million transfer. Both doctors had declared me to be in perfect psychological health, operating at peak cognitive capacity, and fully capable of managing a massive corporate portfolio. Julian noted that filing an emergency medical conservatorship without conducting a single independent medical review was a glaring violation of basic legal procedure. Brenda stepped forward, her voice shrill and desperate. She shouted that those evaluations were fake and that I had paid off the doctors to hide my mental breakdown. She insisted that she was my mother, and she knew I was a danger to myself. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Brenda. His expression was as cold as liquid nitrogen. He informed her that she was currently standing in a private corporate facility, and if she raised her voice one more time, he would have security physically throw her out onto the sidewalk. Brenda snapped her mouth shut, stepping back behind her lawyers. Julian returned his attention to the lead attorney. He moved on to the second fatal flaw in their ridiculous legal strategy. He addressed the claim that they could freeze my newly inherited assets. Julian explained with agonizing clarity that Reginald's trust was not subjected to standard state probate laws. Reginald was a billionaire who had anticipated Brenda's exact brand of toxic greed. He had structured his final directives using a closed federal probate court, utilizing ironclad offshore protections and specific poison pill clauses. Julian stated that the $30 million had already cleared through a highly secure federal routing system that bypassed state jurisdiction entirely. Any attempt by a local state judge to freeze those specific assets was not only legally impossible, but would trigger a countersuit for malicious financial interference. Julian pointed out that Brenda's legal team had failed to check the federal registry before drafting their amateur injunction. The arrogant lawyer was visibly sweating now. He looked down at the certified psychiatric evaluations in his hand, and then looked back at Julian. The blustering confidence he had walked in with was rapidly evaporating. He tried to stammer out a defense, claiming he was acting in good faith based on the sworn affidavits provided by Brenda and Alicia. That was the exact moment Julian delivered the death blow. Julian lowered his voice, dropping the professional courtesy and adopting a tone of pure lethal intimidation. He informed the opposing counsel that relying on those specific affidavits was about to cost him his entire career. Julian pulled out another document from his briefcase. He explained that the primary witness Brenda used to corroborate her claims of my financial instability was Connor. Julian asked the lawyer if he was aware that Connor was currently the primary target of an active federal investigation for wire fraud and illegal underground sports betting. He asked if the lawyer knew that Connor had systematically stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own wife's medical school tuition to pay off violent bookies. The lawyer froze his eyes, darting toward Brenda and Alicia in absolute shock. He clearly had no idea. Brenda had lied to her own legal team, omitting the massive federal crimes her son-in-law had committed in order to expedite the conservatorship. Julian did not give the man a second to recover. He cited the exact Georgia Bar Association ethical statutes the lawyer was currently violating. He stated that knowingly submitting an affidavit from an individual under active federal investigation for severe financial crimes in order to seize control of a separate financial estate constituted suborning perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. Julian promised the man that if he did not withdraw the injunction right this second, he would file a formal grievance before lunch. He swore he would have the lawyer's license permanently suspended and refer his entire firm to the district attorney for participating in an extortion ring. The silence in the lobby was deafening. The only sound was the gentle splashing of the indoor water features. The lead attorney looked at the documents in his hand, looked at Julian's predatory legal team, and then slowly turned to look at Brenda. His face contorted in absolute disgust. He realized he had been played. Brenda had hired him under false pretenses, dragged him into a billionaire's airtight estate plan, and positioned him to lose his license over her personal vendetta. He shoved the fake conservatorship papers directly into Brenda's chest. He told her in a harsh, furious whisper that he was formally terminating their attorney-client privilege effective immediately. He stated that his firm was dropping her case and that he would be sending her an invoice for his wasted time. Brenda panicked. She grabbed the man's sleeve, begging him to stay. She promised to double his retainer and screamed that I was manipulating the truth. She pointed at me wildly, claiming I was just a terrified little girl who was using expensive lawyers to hide her mental breakdown. The lawyer violently yanked his arm out of her grasp. He told her to keep her toxic money and warned her never to contact his firm again. Without another word, he signaled to his 3 associates. They turned their backs on my mother and practically sprinted toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby, desperate to escape the legal landmine they had almost stepped on. I watched Alicia frantically trying to process the humiliation. She looked around the massive lobby, her eyes wide and panicked as she realized that the powerful corporate executives and sharp-dressed employees walking past were all staring at her. She had always prided herself on maintaining a flawless public image. She loved to look down on people she deemed inferior. But right now, she was the one being stared at with pity and disdain. She was standing in my building in my territory, watching her mother throw a desperate temper tantrum while their expensive legal protection quite literally ran away from them. Alicia shrunk back, pulling her designer coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to make herself invisible. Brenda, however, refused to accept defeat. Even as the revolving doors spun behind her retreating lawyers, she turned her vicious glare back to me. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with pure, unadulterated rage. She realized that her primary weapon, the legal system, had just been turned against her and rendered completely useless. She had no leverage left. She had walked into my fortress expecting an easy victory, and instead she had been publicly executed by a team of professionals who saw right through her lies. Julian stepped back, taking his place by my side, but keeping his eyes locked on Brenda, ready to intervene if she tried to escalate the situation physically. The 6 senior partners stood behind us, an impenetrable wall of legal defense. I did not need them to protect me anymore, but the visual statement was undeniably powerful. I had built a life that was heavily fortified against Brenda's specific brand of destruction. I looked at my mother and my sister, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their defeat. They had come to steal my empire, and instead, they had handed me the ultimate confirmation of my absolute supremacy. The legal shredding was complete, and the battlefield belonged entirely to me. I turned my gaze from the revolving doors, where Brenda's legal team had just made their cowardly escape, and locked eyes directly with my sister. Alicia was trembling violently, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a life preserver. For the past 6 months, my sister had been absolutely insufferable on social media. She had posted endless videos and glossy photos boasting about her upcoming private medical practice. She had bragged to every single person in our extended family and all of her elite medical school friends about the prime commercial real estate she had secured in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a state-of-the-art facility featuring imported marble waiting rooms, premium examination suites, and top-tier medical equipment. Of course, she completely failed to mention to her followers that she had not paid a single dime for any of it. Brenda had funded the entire million-dollar venture using the extortion money she had bled from my biological father over the decades. Alicia had paraded around acting like a self-made medical mogul, when in reality she was entirely dependent on a blackmail operation. She had even sent me a petty text message last month telling me that if my little internet business ever failed, she might consider hiring me to answer the phones at her new front desk. I snapped my fingers, and Julian, my general counsel, immediately stepped forward, holding a sleek black leather folder. He handed it to me with a sharp professional nod. I pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents stamped with the official raised seal of the Fulton County Property Registry. I held the papers up so the bright lobby lights illuminated the crisp black text and the unmistakable signatures at the bottom. I asked Alicia if she recognized the address printed at the top of the primary page. She squinted her eyes, darting across the document. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking ashen and hollow. It was the exact address of her highly publicized future medical clinic. I explained the mechanics of true wealth to my sister, loudly enough for my entire security team and the surrounding lobby staff to hear every single word. I told her that when you have $30 million in liquid cash sitting in a Chase private client account, you do not have to wait for mortgage approvals or lengthy escrow periods. You do not have to beg a bank for a commercial loan. You can simply make a phone call and buy whatever you want in cash before noon. I told Alicia I had used a mere fraction of my new inheritance this morning to purchase the entire commercial building right out from under her. I bought the brick, the mortar, the imported marble waiting rooms, and the premium examination suites Brenda had so generously paid to renovate. I informed her that she was no longer dealing with a friendly, lenient corporate landlord who would overlook her lack of business credit. She was dealing with me. I pulled her specific commercial lease agreement from the back of the leather folder. It was the exact contract she had signed and celebrated online just weeks ago. I reminded her of the specific termination clause hidden deep in the fine print of standard commercial leases when properties suddenly change ownership. The new owner holds the absolute right to terminate active leases if the tenant poses a financial or operational liability. I looked at Alicia and told her that being married to a man currently under federal investigation for wire fraud and illegal gambling constituted a massive financial liability to my new property. Then I grabbed the top edge of the thick parchment paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp sound of the tearing paper echoed through the quiet marble lobby. I tore the contract again and again, shredding her grand medical practice into unrecognizable pieces. I let the torn scraps of paper flutter to the floor, landing right on top of Brenda's useless fake conservatorship injunction. Alicia let out a devastating wail. She collapsed to her knees right there in the center of the lobby, sobbing uncontrollably. She scrambled to pick up the torn pieces of her lease, as if she could magically tape her ruined career back together. She cried out to Brenda, begging her mother to fix it, demanding that Brenda use her power to make me give the building back. She sobbed that her grand opening was supposed to be next week, and she had already invited the entire hospital administration board to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Her entire high society reputation, her flawless image, and her professional future were completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. Brenda watched her golden child hit the marble floor, and something inside her completely snapped. The calculated, manipulative matriarch vanished entirely. She lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure venomous desperation. Her eyes were wide and erratic, matching the absolute loss of control she was experiencing. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and unleashed her final, most toxic threat. She hissed that if I did not sign that building and the $30 million over to the family trust right this second, she would destroy me permanently. She threatened to release the sealed police reports and psychiatric hold records from when I was 19 years old. She brought up the darkest moment of my life, the breakdown she had intentionally caused by relentlessly gaslighting me and starving me of affection. She had called the police on me back then, framing my severe depression as a violent outburst just so she could have me forcibly removed from her house. She promised to take those deeply personal sealed medical records and send them to every major media outlet and corporate client I had. She swore she would obliterate my pristine reputation, proving to the world that I was a dangerous, unstable liability who had no business running a corporation. She thought the shame of my past would force me to surrender my future. I did not back away. I did not flinch at the mention of my darkest days. I stepped directly into her space, leaning in so close I could smell the bitter panic radiating off her skin. I looked down at her with a cold, ruthless smile that made her physically tremble. I told her I had already released those exact records to the press this morning as the centerpiece of a massive national mental health awareness campaign. I explained that I had my PR team package my 19-year-old psychiatric hold records alongside a beautifully written press release, detailing how I overcame a severely toxic, emotionally abusive mother to build a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up. I whispered that the public absolutely loves a resilient survivor who turns her trauma into triumph. I watched the realization hit her eyes. I had taken her ultimate weapon, completely neutralized its power, and weaponized it to elevate my own corporate brand. She had nothing left to hold over me. I leaned in a fraction of an inch closer and delivered the final blow. I invited her to check the morning news feeds and let us see who the public really blames. The weekend arrived, carrying the suffocating humidity of an Atlanta summer and the inevitable climax of my mother's desperate charade. Despite the devastating public relations nightmare I had unleashed on her just days prior, Brenda refused to cancel Alicia's extravagant medical school graduation gala. Canceling would mean admitting absolute defeat to the high society circles she worshipped. It would mean explaining why her flawless family was suddenly imploding in the public eye. So instead of hiding, she doubled down. She hosted the massive event at the Heritage Pines Country Club, the most elite, notoriously old money estate in the entire state of Georgia. It was a venue with a 10-year waiting list and a membership fee that required generational wealth to even be considered. I sat in the back of my idling armored SUV, watching the valets scramble to park a parade of Bentleys and Porsches. Through the tinted windows, I could see the grand ballroom glowing with crystal chandeliers. This was supposed to be Alicia's crowning achievement the night she was officially inducted into the upper echelons of Atlanta medical royalty. The guest list was a who is who of the city. Chief surgeons, hospital administrators, wealthy church elders, and local politicians all gathered to celebrate the golden child. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was not wearing my usual sharp corporate blazer. Tonight called for absolute, undeniable dominance. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that cascaded to the floor, paired with a diamond necklace that caught the ambient light like a physical weapon. My hair was styled flawlessly. I looked exactly like the billionaire heiress Reginald had proudly declared me to be. Julian, my general counsel, tapped on the glass of my window. He was flanked by the same 6 senior partners who had decimated my mother's legal team earlier that week. They were dressed in sharp black tuxedos, looking like a highly paid corporate hit squad ready to execute a hostile takeover. Julian gave me a single sharp nod, indicating that the timing was absolutely perfect. We bypassed the valet and walked directly toward the towering mahogany doors of the main ballroom. The heavy oak panels were slightly ajar, allowing the amplified sound of a microphone to spill out into the corridor. I held up my hand, signaling my legal team to stop and listen. It was Brenda. She was standing on the grand stage, bathed in a warm, theatrical spotlight, delivering a sickeningly sweet speech to the captivated audience. Her voice dripped with manufactured maternal warmth, completely devoid of the vicious venom she had hurled at me just days ago. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, painting herself as the ultimate matriarch who had single-handedly raised 2 perfect, successful daughters through nothing but faith and massive personal sacrifice. She spoke about Alicia as if she had cured a global disease, rather than barely scraping through her medical exams on Connor's stolen money. Then, without missing a single beat, my mother had the absolute audacity to bring up my name. She offered the crowd a fake, mournful sigh, adjusting her stolen pearl necklace. She lied flawlessly into the microphone. She told the hundreds of distinguished guests that it broke her heart that her oldest daughter Jasmine could not be there to celebrate tonight. She claimed I was currently halfway across the world in Tokyo, closing a massive international corporate merger for my firm. She spun a beautiful, touching narrative about how incredibly close we were and how proud she was of her two brilliant, driven girls. She was using my real, hard-earned success to buy herself social currency with people who did not even know my face. She wanted the applause. She wanted the envy of the other mothers in the room. She wanted to maintain the absolute illusion of total control. I placed both of my hands flat against the heavy mahogany doors and shoved them open with enough force to make the solid brass hinges groan. The heavy thud of the doors hitting the interior walls echoed like a thunderclap across the massive ballroom. The classical string quartet playing softly in the corner immediately stopped mid-note. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the entrance in perfect unison. I stepped over the threshold and into the light. The emerald silk of my gown swept across the imported marble floor. Julian and my 6 corporate attorneys fanned out in a rigid formation right behind me, an imposing wall of dark suits blocking the exit. The absolute silence in the ballroom was deafening. I could hear the sharp collective intake of breath from the prominent society members who recognized me from the recent national news cycles. They had read the press release. They had seen the unsealed police reports. They knew exactly who I was and the brutal, undeniable truth about what Brenda had done to me when I was 19. I kept my eyes locked dead center on the stage. Brenda was frozen behind the podium. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wooden stage with a harsh, screeching feedback loop that made half the room wince. All the fake maternal warmth instantly evaporated from her face, replaced by a raw, visceral panic. She looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Alicia, who was sitting at the guest of honor table right below the stage, shot up from her chair so fast she knocked over her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, a sharp physical mirroring of the illusion breaking around them. Connor sat completely paralyzed next to her, sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. I did not break my stride. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, cutting straight through the sea of perfectly decorated tables. I did not look at the hospital administrators or the church elders. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the woman who had spent 32 years trying to destroy me. Brenda's panic quickly morphed into desperate, frantic anger. She realized her entire social standing was evaporating in real time. She lunged forward, grabbing the microphone stand with both hands to steady her trembling knees. She screamed into the mic, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. She commanded the venue security team to intervene immediately. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and yelled for the guards to arrest the trespassing lunatic and drag me out of the ballroom before I ruined her daughter's special night. 4 large security guards stationed around the perimeter of the room stepped forward, instinctively reaching for their radios. The wealthy crowd murmured in shock, expecting a violent physical altercation right there in the dining room. I did not even break my elegant stride. I did not look at the approaching guards. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The head of venue security, a tall, imposing man wearing an earpiece, instantly stepped out from the shadows near the stage. He raised his hand in a sharp, tactical gesture. The 4 approaching guards immediately froze in their tracks. They looked at their supervisor, then looked at me. In total unison, they crossed their arms behind their backs and stepped away, returning to their posts at the edges of the room. They completely ignored Brenda's frantic, screaming commands. Brenda slammed her hand against the podium, screaming at the head of security, demanding to know why he was not doing his job. She shrieked that she had paid $50,000 to rent this luxury ballroom, and she demanded that the trespassing ghetto trash be thrown out onto the street immediately. I reached the base of the grand stage, my emerald dress pooling around my heels. I looked up at my mother, tilting my head slightly. I did not need a microphone for my voice to carry across the dead silent room. I told her she was embarrassing herself in front of her friends. I told her the security team was doing exactly what they were paid to do. They were just no longer taking orders from her. I slowly climbed the velvet-lined steps, ascending onto the stage and stepping directly into her carefully curated spotlight. The sheer proximity made Brenda physically recoil as if I radiated a heat she could not withstand. I reached out and calmly pried the microphone from her rigid, trembling fingers, taking absolute control of the stage, the narrative, and the entire room. I curled my fingers tightly around the cool metal of the microphone. Brenda stood completely paralyzed next to the podium, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. She tried to reach out and snatch the microphone back, but I simply sidestepped her pathetic attempt. I turned my back on my mother and faced the sea of elite Atlanta society. Hundreds of eyes stared up at me, reflecting the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp sound echoed through the massive ballroom, commanding absolute obedience from every single person in the room. I smiled a brilliant, razor-sharp smile and spoke directly to the stunned crowd. I said good evening to the hospital administrators, the church elders, and the local politicians. I told them I understood they were expecting me to be in Tokyo, closing a massive international corporate merger, just as my loving mother had so proudly announced a few minutes ago. I let a short, cold laugh escape my lips. I informed the room that my mother has always possessed a remarkably creative imagination, especially when she needs to cover up her own failures. I paced slowly across the edge of the grand stage, ensuring my emerald green silk gown caught the spotlight. I projected my voice so it reached the very back of the room. I told the distinguished guests that I was not overseas. I was standing right here in Atlanta, running my own multi-million-dollar public relations and e-commerce empire. An empire I built completely alone without a single drop of support from the woman cowering behind me. I pointed directly at Brenda, who was shrinking back against the heavy velvet stage curtains. I exposed her lies with surgical precision. I announced to the entire ballroom that the woman who just claimed full credit for raising two perfect daughters actually kicked me out of her house when I was 20 years old. I told the crowd that Brenda threw me onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes because I refused to be a pawn in her toxic game. I explained that she spent the last 12 years telling her church friends I was a worthless junkie while I was actually building a corporate fortress. She only decided to claim me as her precious daughter tonight because she found out my net worth recently surpassed $30 million. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in horror. Church elders exchanged disgusted glances. The flawless, pristine reputation Brenda had spent decades building was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. Down on the floor. Alicia finally snapped out of her shock. She slammed her hands on the guest of honor table and screamed at the top of her lungs. She demanded that I get off the stage and stop ruining the most important night of her life. She yelled that I was a jealous, bitter liar trying to steal her spotlight because I could never achieve what she had achieved. She clung to her golden child complex, desperate to maintain her illusion of superiority, even as the walls closed in around her. I stopped pacing and looked directly down at my sister. I did not yell back. I spoke with a lethal calm that silenced the entire room all over again. I told Alicia that I had zero interest in stealing her spotlight because her entire life was already a complete fraud. I told her that her beautiful graduation gala, her designer dress, and her perfect medical degree were all funded by stolen money and dark secrets. Alicia shrieked, denying everything. She pointed at her husband Connor, who was sitting rigidly beside her, sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo. She proudly declared that Connor was a highly successful financial executive who provided everything for her, and that I was just a sad, lonely woman fabricating vicious rumors. I smiled down at my white brother-in-law, watching the sheer terror dilate his pupils. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out my smartphone. I told Alicia it was funny she mentioned Connor's financial expertise because he and I recently had a very illuminating conversation about his specific investment strategies. I synced my phone to the ballroom's massive Bluetooth sound system. I turned the volume up to maximum capacity. I held my phone near the microphone just to ensure there was absolutely zero audio interference. I looked right at Connor and pressed play. Connor's frantic, desperate voice blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The audio quality was pristine, capturing every single drop of his pathetic, sweat-soaked fear from the steakhouse parking lot 2 nights ago. The entire ballroom heard Connor begging me for a 20% cut of my $30 million inheritance. They heard his voice crack as he admitted he knew exactly how to hide money in offshore Cayman Island shell companies to keep it away from Brenda and Alicia. The wealthy crowd gasped in loud unison as the audio continued. Connor confessed loudly and clearly that he was in deep, unimaginable trouble. He admitted that he had systematically stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Alicia's medical school tuition to fund his high-stakes underground sports betting addiction. The recording echoed relentlessly across the crystal chandeliers bouncing off the imported marble floors. A prominent hospital board member sitting near the front row actually dropped his silver fork onto his china plate in pure shock. Connor begged me for $6 million to pay off violent bookies who were threatening to break his legs. He confessed that federal authorities were actively auditing his investment firm and that he was going to be indicted for wire fraud and sent to federal prison by Friday if he did not replace the missing client funds. I let the recording play until the very end, until Connor's pathetic, desperate sobbing filled the silent ballroom. Then I paused the audio and slipped my phone back into my pocket. I looked down at the guest of honor table. Alicia looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her mouth was open in a silent scream of pure devastation. She slowly turned her head to look at the man sitting next to her. The man she had paraded around as her wealthy, successful provider. The man who had secretly bankrupted her, stolen her future, and put her life in danger with violent criminals. Connor did not look at his wife. He did not try to explain or apologize or spin a new lie. The undeniable proof of his federal crimes had just been broadcast to a room full of hospital administrators, local politicians, and high society elites. His career was obliterated. His marriage was dead. His freedom was officially over. Pure animal panic took over. Connor shoved his chair back so violently it crashed into the table behind him, knocking over a massive floral centerpiece and shattering several expensive wine glasses. He abandoned Alicia without a single word. He pushed past the stunned wealthy guests, knocking a well-dressed older woman out of his way as he made a mad, frantic dash toward the back of the room. I was not heading for the main lobby doors, where my corporate attorneys and the security team were standing. He was sprinting wildly toward the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen, desperate to escape through the service exit. He looked like a rat fleeing a sinking ship, his rented tuxedo jacket flapping behind him as his dress shoes slipped on spilled champagne. He shoved past the horrified waitstaff carrying trays of appetizers, crashing through the kitchen doors and disappearing from sight. Alicia finally found her voice. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail, watching her husband abandon her in front of every single person she had ever tried to impress. She collapsed into her chair, hiding her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect high society graduation gala morphed into a highly publicized crime scene. Up on the stage, Brenda was completely paralyzed. She stood pressed against the heavy velvet curtains, breathing heavily, her eyes wide with shock. She had lost control of her golden child. She had lost control of her wealthy son-in-law. She had lost control of her entire social standing. The flawless narrative she had spent decades meticulously crafting was reduced to a pile of burning rubble in under 5 minutes. I stood at the edge of the stage looking out over the absolute chaos I had orchestrated. The room was buzzing with scandalized whispers and frantic phone calls as guests eagerly shared the destruction of the Carter family with the outside world. I had promised my father I would use the immense power he gave me to shatter the chains Brenda had kept me in. I was keeping that promise with brutal, flawless precision, and the main event was just getting started. I watched the heavy wooden doors of the catering kitchen swing violently back and forth after Connor crashed through them. The panicked gasps and murmured outrage of the Atlanta elite filled the grand ballroom, but I was not finished. I had promised to shatter the chains Brenda had kept me in, and I intended to burn the entire fortress down. I did not give the wealthy audience a single second to recover from the shock of Connor's criminal confession. I raised my free hand and signaled the audiovisual booth stationed at the back of the room. I had paid the lead technician triple his normal rate earlier that afternoon to ensure absolute compliance. The massive crystal chandeliers illuminating the ballroom suddenly dimmed. 3 enormous high-definition projection screens descended smoothly from the vaulted ceiling right above the grand stage. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. Everyone stared up at the blank screens, anticipating the next strike. The screens flared to life simultaneously. The image of Reginald appeared towering over the ballroom. Even hooked up to medical monitors in his sterile hospital suite, the billionaire commanded absolute authority. His dark silk robe contrasted sharply with the white pillows behind him, but it was his piercing brown eyes that captured the room. He looked directly into the camera lens, and his deep, resonant voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. He did not mince his words. He introduced himself to the audience by his full name, a name that every single hospital administrator, corporate executive, and church elder in that room immediately recognized. A collective shockwave ripped through the audience. Reginald was a titan of Atlanta industry, a man whose philanthropic endowments and corporate acquisitions had shaped the very city they lived in. Reginald took a slow, labored breath on the massive screens, and then he pointed the finger of blame directly at the woman cowering behind the podium. He told the room that he was recording this final message because his battle with pancreatic cancer was ending, and he needed the world to know the true face of Brenda Carter. He exposed her decades of relentless extortion with surgical precision. He explained how 32 years ago, Brenda had used her pregnancy not as a blessing, but as a weapon of mass financial destruction. He detailed the blackmail campaign she orchestrated, threatening to destroy his marriage and his corporate empire if he did not pay her millions in silence money. The wealthy socialites in the front row physically recoiled, turning to stare at Brenda in absolute horror. The prominent church elders, who had just been applauding her fake maternal piety, now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Reginald's voice echoed with a profound, heavy sorrow as he described the agonizing reality of his extortion. He told the hundreds of distinguished guests that Brenda forced him to sign away his parental rights and sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. He confessed that every luxury car Brenda drove, every designer dress Alicia wore, and every exorbitant country club membership they flaunted was funded entirely by the blood money she bled from his accounts. Then his tone shifted from sorrow to a burning, righteous fury. He told the room about the day he hired private investigators and discovered that Brenda had viciously kicked his daughter out onto the streets. He exposed her fake narrative, completely destroying her claim that I was a troubled failure. He proudly declared that I was his biological daughter. He announced that he had secretly funded my survival through an anonymous trust, watching me build my massive public relations and e-commerce firm from the shadows. He proclaimed to the entire high society crowd that I had inherited his relentless, unyielding spirit and that he was leaving me his entire $30 million liquid fortune and his vast commercial real estate portfolio. The screens faded to black, leaving the ballroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. Brenda snapped out of her paralyzed state. The realization that her entire social standing, her pristine reputation, and her carefully crafted high society identity had just been publicly executed sent her into a blind, frantic rage. She lunged forward, grabbing the microphone stand and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure venomous panic. She shrieked at the audiovisual booth, demanding that they cut the power immediately. She screamed that the video was a deepfake, a malicious AI-generated lie created by a jealous, mentally unstable daughter. But the crowd was not buying it. They had seen the bank records I dropped on the table. They had heard Connor's sweaty, pathetic confession. The illusion was completely shattered and Brenda was standing naked in the wreckage. When the crowd did not rally to her defense, Brenda turned her psychotic fury entirely on me. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and threatened to destroy me. She screamed that I had made the biggest mistake of my life crashing her private event. She yelled that she personally knew the board of directors of the Heritage Pines Country Club. She bragged about her platinum membership status and swore she would have me permanently banned from this estate and every other elite venue in the state of Georgia. She commanded the security guards to physically drag me out of the ballroom and throw me onto the street where I belonged. I did not back away. I stood in the center of the stage, the emerald silk of my gown catching the returning light of the chandeliers. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile that made her frantic screaming falter. I reached out and gently tapped the microphone, silencing her hysterical rant. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and delivered the ultimate fatal blow. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. The Heritage Pines Country Club was an incredibly exclusive estate with a very strict board of directors. But she had made one massive catastrophic miscalculation. I snapped my fingers and Julian stepped forward, holding a heavy leather-bound legal binder. He handed it up to me. I opened the binder and held up a crisp, watermarked legal document for the entire front row to see. I informed Brenda that Reginald did not just have a sprawling portfolio of downtown commercial buildings. His holding company actively owned the very land and the historic estate that housed this prestigious country club. I explained that because his probate had cleared this morning, the deed had officially transferred into my name. I looked down at the woman who had spent 32 years telling me I was worthless, and I lowered my voice to a lethal calm tone. I told her she could not have me banned from the country club because as of 9 o'clock this morning, I owned the entire building, the golf course, and the very stage she was standing on. Brenda's jaw dropped. The last shred of color completely drained from her face. Her legs physically gave out and she collapsed against the wooden podium, sliding down until she hit the stage floor. She was completely broken, stripped of her money, her leverage, and her borrowed power. I turned my attention to the head of venue security, who was standing at the edge of the stage waiting for my command. I instructed him to gather his team and immediately escort these trespassing individuals off my property. Before the security chief could even take a step forward, the heavy swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen burst open again. Connor had not made it far. He stumbled backward into the grand ballroom, his rented tuxedo jacket ripped, and his dress shirt soaked in sweat. He was not walking voluntarily. Two large men wearing dark windbreakers with federal badges clipped to their belts were gripping his arms, dragging him back into the light. I had not just recorded his extortion attempt in the parking lot 2 nights ago. I had securely transmitted that crystal-clear audio file directly to the federal prosecutors who were already investigating his investment firm. They had been waiting outside the service exits of the country club all evening, letting the graduation gala proceed until they had their target completely cornered. Connor sobbed uncontrollably as the federal agents slapped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists right in front of the horrified high society crowd. They read him his rights, reciting charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and illegal gambling distribution. Alicia let out a devastating wail from the floor, watching her fake, successful husband being marched out of the ballroom like a common criminal. I stood on my stage, looking down at the total destruction of their toxic empire. The ghetto college dropout they had tried to erase was now the undisputed owner of the kingdom, and the eviction notice was permanent. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut behind the federal agents, dragging Connor away in handcuffs. The absolute silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. By Monday morning, the Atlanta business journals and local news stations were running the story nonstop. The headline was undeniable and completely devastating. Prominent financial executive indicted for massive wire fraud and illegal gambling ring at high society gala. They showed raw, unedited footage of Connor sweating and weeping as he was shoved into the back of a black government SUV. His arrogant white privilege could not save him from a federal grand jury. The financial authorities immediately seized every single one of his assets and froze his accounts, leaving him to rot in a concrete holding cell while he awaited a trial that would inevitably end in a lengthy prison sentence. Alicia did not fare any better. The golden child was entirely stripped of her fake wealth and her stolen prestige in a matter of hours. The morning after the gala, her elite medical school administrators called her into a closed-door disciplinary meeting. Connor had not just stolen her final year of tuition. He had bounced fraudulent checks across multiple hospital networks in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. Alicia was suddenly on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid academic fees. She had the absolute audacity to call my corporate office that afternoon and demand that I use my inheritance to bail her out. She screamed through the phone, claiming we were still sisters and that I owed her for the public humiliation I caused at her party. I sat at my sleek glass desk, looking out over the Atlanta skyline, and laughed. I told her the only thing I owed her was a reality check. I reminded her that she had sat back and smirked while Connor tried to force me to pay a $15,000 dinner bill just days ago. I informed her that she was no longer a high society princess, but a broke medical student drowning in criminal debt. I hung up the phone and instructed my security team to permanently block her number. Without the luxury private practice I had snatched out from under her and facing catastrophic financial ruin, Alicia was publicly humiliated in front of her entire professional circle. None of her wealthy medical friends would even return her calls. They treated her like a highly contagious disease. Desperate to avoid bankruptcy and completely broke, she was forced to accept a grueling, low-paying medical residency at an underfunded rural clinic 3 states away. The girl who used to mock my cheap clothes and my lip gloss hustle was now working 80-hour shifts, taking a public bus to a cramped shared apartment just to survive. But the most spectacular collapse belonged entirely to Brenda. She actually thought she could simply gaslight her way out of the devastation. The Sunday after the gala, she had the nerve to put on her finest designer hat and march into our prominent Atlanta church, expecting to take her usual seat in the front pew. She expected the congregation to pity her and treat her like a victim of a cruel daughter. Instead, the head pastor and the church elders physically blocked her from entering the sanctuary. They had all been at the graduation gala. They had seen Reginald's video exposing her decades of ruthless blackmail and greed. The pastor informed her in front of the entire arriving congregation that her toxic presence was no longer welcome on holy ground. He told her she had used the church as a shield for her extortion and that she was a disgrace to their community. Brenda was forced to do a humiliating walk of shame back to her luxury SUV while hundreds of people she had spent her life trying to impress whispered and pointed at her. She was entirely socially exiled. Her carefully manicured reputation as a pious, high-class matriarch was reduced to a cautionary tale of vicious greed. She was completely blacklisted from her exclusive country club networks. Her former friends deleted her number and refused to acknowledge her existence in public. The social death was only the beginning of Brenda's nightmare. When the federal authorities unraveled Connor's illegal gambling syndicate, they discovered a massive web of interconnected debt. Brenda, in her infinite arrogance and desire to maintain their wealthy facade, had co-signed several of Connor's fraudulent business loans, using her sprawling suburban mansion as collateral. With Connor in federal custody and the extortion gravy train completely derailed by my biological father's death, Brenda had absolutely zero income to cover the astronomical payments. The banks did not care about her designer wardrobe or her previous country club status. They foreclosed on her home within 30 days. She was unceremoniously evicted and forced to watch as ruthless repo men hauled away her luxury furniture, her imported art, and her expensive cars to pay off the debts. The woman who had kicked me out onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes when I was 20 years old was now packing her own miserable belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. She was forced to move into a cramped, run-down apartment complex on the very edge of the city entirely alone. She had no husband to fund her lifestyle, no golden child to parade around, and no stolen money to hide behind. She was drowning in the toxic debt, her precious son-in-law left behind, isolated in a tiny living room with nothing but her own bitter reflections for company. The empire of lies she had spent 32 years building had been completely leveled, and I had not even had to break a sweat to watch it fall. 3 months passed in a blur of relentless expansion and absolute peace. The toxic noise that had plagued my entire existence was completely gone, replaced by the steady hum of a corporate empire running at peak efficiency. I was sitting at my executive desk reviewing our latest quarterly earnings when the private intercom chimed. My head of security informed me that there was a situation developing in the main lobby. He said a woman matching my mother's description had managed to slip past the outer courtyard gates by tailgating a delivery truck and was currently refusing to leave the reception desk. I did not panic. I simply pressed a button on my dual monitor setup and pulled up the live high-definition security feed from the ground floor. The cameras captured a scene that was almost unrecognizable. Brenda stood in the center of the massive marble lobby, but she was a hollow shadow of the arrogant matriarch who had tried to legally terrorize me in this exact spot just 90 days ago. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a faded, ill-fitting dress. The pristine styling she used to flaunt at her country club was entirely absent. She looked aged, exhausted, and completely stripped of her manufactured power. She was weeping, clinging to the edge of the reception desk, begging the security guards to let her upstairs. Through the audio feed, I could hear her pleading, playing the victim card with desperate theatricality. She cried that she was completely broke, that she was about to be evicted from her miserable, cramped apartment, and that she just needed to see her precious daughter. She pleaded for a small loan just to survive the winter, claiming that she had made mistakes, but that blood was thicker than water. I sat back in my leather ergonomic chair and watched the screen. For 32 years, the mere sound of her voice crying or yelling would send my nervous system into absolute overdrive. I had spent my entire youth terrified of her wrath and desperately craving her validation. But sitting there watching her pathetic performance, I realized something incredibly profound. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I did not feel the fiery rush of vindication, or the desire to march down there and gloat over her destruction. I felt absolutely nothing. It was a pure, deep, impenetrable indifference. She was no longer the all-powerful monster of my childhood. She was just a stranger making a scene in my corporate lobby. The trauma bond was irrevocably broken. I picked up the phone, connecting directly to the security chief standing right next to Brenda. I did not ask to speak to her. I did not offer her a single cent or a moment of my time. I simply gave a calm, unwavering directive. I instructed the security team to escort the trespasser off the property immediately. I told them to add her face to the permanent ban list across all my commercial buildings and residential properties. I hung up the phone and watched the screen as two large guards gently but firmly took Brenda by the arms and guided her out the revolving glass doors. She looked back up toward the penthouse one last time before disappearing onto the busy Atlanta streets. I closed the security window on my monitor, opened a new financial spreadsheet, and went back to work without a second thought. The cycle of emotional abuse was officially dead. By the time evening rolled around, I left the corporate headquarters and took my private driver back to my newly purchased personal residence. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse, occupying the entire top floor of a high-rise in Buckhead. I walked through the double doors into the expansive, open-concept living area, tossing my keys onto a solid marble console table. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city lights sparkled like diamonds against the dark velvet sky, but my attention was focused on the massive dining table in the center of the room. Spread across the polished wood surface were 36 architectural blueprints and detailed zoning permits. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and leaned over the documents, tracing the layout with my fingertip. These were not plans for a new corporate office or another e-commerce distribution center. These were the finalized designs for the Reginald Foundation. I had taken a substantial portion of the $30 million inheritance my biological father left me and funneled it directly into creating a massive state-of-the-art tech and business incubator. But this facility was not for seasoned executives or privileged graduates. I designed the foundation specifically to support young African American women who had been disowned, thrown out, or emotionally abused by toxic, manipulative families. I knew exactly what it felt like to sleep on a lumpy couch with $20 in my pocket, terrified of the future, because the people who were supposed to protect me had actively tried to destroy me. I knew the crushing weight of being called a failure and a disappointment. The Reginald Foundation was built to be the ultimate safety net I never had. The facility would provide full tuition grants, intensive entrepreneurial mentorship, mental health counseling, and secure housing for brilliant young women who needed a safe space to turn their survival instincts into corporate empires. I was going to use my father's secret legacy to ensure that no other girl with a dream would ever have to choose between enduring abuse and freezing on the streets. I signed my name at the bottom of the final authorization form, finalizing the multi-million-dollar construction budget. I closed the leather binder holding the blueprints and walked out onto the expansive glass balcony. The warm southern breeze washed over me, carrying the faint sounds of the bustling city far below. I rested my hands on the cool metal railing and looked out over the empire I had conquered and the new one I was actively building. I thought about the terrified 20-year-old girl dragging a garbage bag of clothes down the sidewalk. I thought about the labels Brenda and Alicia had tried to brand me with: the ghetto college dropout, the ugly duckling, the absolute disappointment of the family. Those words used to cut me to the bone, but tonight they meant absolutely nothing. They had tried to bury me, but they did not realize I was a seed. I had taken their cruelty, their rejection, and their relentless theft, and forged it into unbreakable armor. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was a self-made CEO, a billionaire heiress, and an untouchable mogul who had completely reclaimed her narrative. I honored the father who loved me from the shadows, and I obliterated the toxic abusers who tried to steal my light. I looked up at the stars shining brightly over Atlanta, knowing with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. The throne was mine, and I was never giving it back. The greatest lesson I learned from the ashes of my toxic family is that blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your peace or your success. For years, I believed that my mother's rejection meant I was fundamentally flawed. I thought I had to shrink myself to fit into a space where I was only valued as a punching bag or a scapegoat. But true liberation begins the moment you realize that the people who continually tear you down are not exposing your weaknesses, they are projecting their own deep insecurities. Walking away from the very people who were supposed to protect me was the most terrifying thing I ever did. But it was also the only way to save my own life. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. I had to build my own empire, block out their relentless noise, and define my worth entirely on my own terms. Sometimes the most beautiful act of self-love is recognizing that a closed door is not a punishment, but a profound form of protection. You are the architect of your own destiny, and your trauma does not dictate your future. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace, please share how you found the courage to walk away in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your absolute power.